All right, well, I would like to say welcome. My name is Ryan Rowenfeld. Far be it for me to not think that I wouldn't be able to get some coffee at a Mormon Trail Conference. This is the Black Box Theater. This is session number 2. We are talking about Native Americans, Lewis and Clark, and the early beginnings of Counts of Bluffs. First up, we are going to have Jay Buckley speaking about Lewis and Clark in the Middle Missouri, Friends, Furs, and Fort. Everybody only has 20 minutes to talk. That's why they get a German to take care of the time. So, Mr. Buckley.
Okay. I thought he was going to put some slides for each of this, but it's all good.
Yeah,
I'll keep my own time so that I make sure it doesn't cheat me out for a few minutes. Well, happy birthday, Iowans. It's good to be with you. I'm excited to be here. Today, we're going to be talking about Lewis and Clark at Council Bluff and how that name affected this area. I found it interesting to note that the Otos in Missouri, their name for the Platte River was Nebraska, which became Nebraska as the state. So whenever you drive by or see the Platte, maybe you can remember that. I'm going to be covering 3 themes very quickly because I only have 20 minutes to cover 40 years. Dick asked me to speak about from Lewis and Clark till the coming of the Mormons. So we'll see how I do on that. I want to start out with the Louisiana Purchase. This was on the 30th of April, 1803. This purchase by Jefferson's delegates of 828,000 square miles of territory for $15 million altered the course of the United States and arguably the world. Not only did it double the territorial size, but also had some key geopolitical altercations for Native nations and for others that would be affected by this. This is one of my favorite maps of all time. It was by Nicholas King. It was a map that Lewis and Clark took with them on their journey to explore the Louisiana Purchase. And I love it because right in the middle, I blew it up here so you can see it a little bit better. It says conjectural. I've only seen this on one map. You never see a cartographer that says, I don't know what's there. But I find this fascinating because this was one of the tasks that Jefferson wanted Lewis and Clark to do, is to map the territory, the geography, the people, the animals, the plants, the minerals, the vegetables, everything they could find out about this newly acquired territory. And Jefferson sent a letter to Meriwether Lewis with a whole list of items that he wanted him to do. It runs about 4 pages in very small print, and so it's got quite a few tasks. But the thesis of the letter is this, that the object of the Lewis and Clark expedition was to explore the Missouri River and such principal streams as may offer the most direct and practical water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. So whatever you read about or learn of the expedition, keep that in the back of your mind, that that's foremost what they need to report back on. And as they're traveling on this 864-day journey across the continent to the Pacific Ocean and back, they're going to be noting those elements that Jefferson wanted to know. Of course, river travel was quite difficult. The Missouri and its confluence with the Mississippi is flowing about 7 or 8 miles per hour. They're going to have to fight that current for over a year and a half to make it upstream. But around the 4th of July, they were nearing the upper edge of modern-day Kansas and about to cross over into Nebraska. And it's about there in their journals that they write these important words, the plains commence. So they're recognizing this change in the vegetation and the flora and fauna that they've been seeing, and they know that they're near to the Great Plains. Now, they knew they were going to meet a number of Indian nations. They traveled over 600 miles up the Missouri yet and still hadn't come into contact with any, and therefore they were very interested in making contact. The 21st of July, 1804, they arrive at the confluence of the Platte River. And William Clark notes in his journal that the Platte River was more rapid than the Missouri, its current pushing us to the opposite shore. We found great difficulty in passing around the sand at the mouth of the river. He recognized this was a key river because it discharged about 3.5 cubic feet, or 3.5 miles per hour current, joining with the Missouri's 3.5 miles. That's what made it the 7 to 8 miles an hour. And he sends out some diplomats to go and see if they can find the Osage. He sends his two mixed race members, George Drouillard, who was half Shawnee, half French, and Pierre Cruzat, who was half Omaha and French. And they're seeking the Oto and Missouri peoples. The Otos name for themselves means the people of this place. So you can see that although they had moved from further east, they were now near the mouth of the Platte. I show this map to indicate that the river was much nearer the Bluffs in the Fort Calhoun region than it is today. The river flowed right next to the bluff. There was a little elevated land above that where they camped and called it our Council Bluff Camp. And then up on top of the bluff, they also explored, and that became the site of Fort Atkinson. Lewis and Clark did eventually meet with delegates of the Oto and Missouri peoples. Big Horse represented the Missouri. Little Thief was not present for the Otos, but some of the headmen from that nation were there. They shared food together, just as we will over the course of the next few days. And they also talked about the reasons why Lewis and Clark were there. First of all, Lewis and Clark expected or hoped that they could establish some type of internecine peace, not understanding that in Plains nations, that was really a non-starter unless you were relatives. So they have this conference on Saturday, the 3rd of August in 1804, and they explained to Big Horse that they would like to meet again 80 miles to the north up where the Omaha villages were. So this is the council number 2. It takes place on the 18th and 19th of August, just a few weeks later, and Big Horse and Little Thief are both there. They reiterate some of their same objectives: to encourage peace, to promote trade, to promise that they will build fur trading posts to provide goods to the nations, and also the possibilities of providing forts to protect them and their friends from enemy attack. They also invited them to send delegations of their tribes to visit with President Jefferson. And on the return trip in 1805 of Colonel Worthington, who leaves Fort Mandan in the spring and brings the keelboat down, he will actually pick up Little Thief, two Oto and a Missouri, and they travel down to St. Louis on their way to Washington. Unfortunately, Little Thief becomes ill. He wants to return to his homeland, so he and the Otos leave. He dies somewhere along the Missouri River in modern-day Missouri. But the Missouri did travel and meet with President Jefferson, and this is an image of another member of that delegation that was painted by Carl Bodmer. When Lewis and Clark returned from their epic trip, they had done many of the things that that Jefferson had tasked them to do. Most importantly, they had filled in the map that Nicholas King had said was conjectural, and this is William Clark's map based upon Indian cartography and information, explorers, fur traders, and his own direct observations. You can see that it's a lot more detailed and complicated than the King map. His master map that's published in the Nicholas Biddle and Paul Allen edition of the journals in 1814 will show that even more clearly. So let's look about the fur trade. How did the Lewis and Clark expedition jumpstart that fur trade or advance it even faster than it was already going? Because Lewis and Clark had met fur traders on their way up and their way back, so there were already people plying this trade. In Lewis's letter to Jefferson, the day they got back to St. Louis, he says, "The Missouri and all of its branches abound in more beaver and common otter than any other streams on earth." So you think that would catch Jefferson's attention when he reads that letter and says, aha, this is gonna work out. That same day, William Clark writes a letter to his brother Jonathan saying much the same thing. This tract of continent is of immense advantage to the fur trade, for all of the furs collected in 9/10 of the most valuable fur country in America can be conveyed via the mouth of the Columbia and shipped from thence to the East Indies by the 1st of August each year to reach Canton. So here's the international trade that Jefferson's looking for. They can take furs from the Otos and Missouri, trade them with a native, trade them at trading posts, and eventually find their way to Asia. Well, the following spring, Manuel Lisa hires about 10 of the Lewis and Clark expedition members, and they head upstream. He forms a little company to participate in the fur trade, and he's going to the very places that Lewis and Clark had identified would be good places for fur posts or for military installations. And when he was at the camp at Council Bluff, he identified that place as an ideal location for both. And indeed, within 5 years, there would be activity on both fronts. Some of these delegations of natives that Lewis and Clark had invited and escorted to Washington need to go home. And one of the tasks of some of these fur companies was to escort these native delegations back to their homelands. Occasionally, it made it difficult, though, to make these excursions because the nations through which they passed were not on good terms with the delegations. So this made it a little tricky, especially with the case of Sheheke, who was a Mandan leader, found it nearly impossible to get past the Arikaras and Lakotas. America was practicing what was called the Indian factory system. This is where native peoples would hunt hides and furs and bring them into posts to exchange them for goods at cost. These were government operated. They were not to turn a profit. In fact, they ran heavily into debt. Some of the private entrepreneurs said, these factories only work in the close vicinity to American civilization. What about beyond that? Could we get some changes made? So in 1809, Manuel Lisa formed the St. Louis, Missouri Fur Company, and William Clark and Meriwether Lewis and Lewis's brother Reuben all joined this company as private ventures that would participate in private trading above the mouth of the Platte, which was considered the dividing line between the lower and upper Missouri rivers. So whenever you read about the upper Missouri fur trade, they're saying the Platte River north. This was the key place. They also construct forts. They send materials down to William Clark, who stores them at his store in St. Louis. He can also have access to Indian goods through his brother, who runs a store in Philadelphia. Clark served as the company director and the resident agent for this fur company. And one of the things he did was to make sure that the Missouri Fur Company built posts near all of the tribes that he had promised trading posts to. So, for example, you can see that circle where it says Lisa. This is where Manuel Lisa built a post for the Otos, Missouri, Omaha peoples here in the Council Bluffs region. And by the mid-18 and 20s, the entire region from, say, Fort Atkinson down to the Platte was known as the Council Bluffs area, even though their camp had been called Council Bluff, singular. And here we are on Mosquito Creek at Iowa Western Community College. This is also the same creek along which the Mormon pioneers were settled. It's where the Iowa peoples lived until they moved back to Des Moines near the turn of the 19th century. And further upstream, you see a more detailed map. This is from Diplomat, who was a Catholic priest who traveled upstream. And you note that he's got both Old Lisa's Post, which was that early fur post, and the Council Bluff labeled on his map. This brings us to the last part, the forts. In 1819, the Jeffersonians had failed to explore one of the streams of the Louisiana Purchase, and that was the Nebraska or Platte River. So they sent the Long expedition to do so. A long part of this Yellowstone expedition were to build fortifications all the way up to the mouth of the Yellowstone and Columbia rivers. Well, they made it to Council Bluffs, where they got bogged down. They were beset by the mosquitoes, hence the name Mosquito Creek. They were having troubles with their steamboats. This is as far as any steamboat had traveled in 1819. And so they decided to erect a fortification. They call it Cantonment, Missouri. It's built on the lower part of the bluff, floods in the spring, so the next year they build it up top and they rename it Fort Atkinson after Henry Atkinson. That fort lasts from 1821 to 1827. It's one of the most important forts of the early West. At its high point, it had almost a quarter of all of the soldiers in the United States Army, about 1,200, and it's involved in a number of things. In 1827, when it ends, most of the 6th Regiment traveled down to Jefferson Barracks, which is a new establishment just south of St. Louis. And Clark and others also argued for the establishment of a new fort further down by Kansas, and Fort Leavenworth is created. It's the 2nd oldest military establishment in the West. In 1822, this desire to make the fur trade more profitable with the factory system that was failing changes when an influential senator, Thomas Hart Benton, proposes that the factory system be ended and private entrepreneurs be contracted to go trade with the natives. William Clark at the same time becomes the superintendent for all tribes of the American West, with only a few exceptions. And for the next 15 or 18 years, he's going to be the central figure in the Upper Missouri fur trade. He grants licenses to people like William H. Ashley and Andrew Henry, William Becknell, who are all advertising for a few good men to go up the rivers and hunt fur. People like Charles Bent, Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger are all part of this gang. These expeditions map further the cartography and geography that Jefferson had been so interested in. Jefferson, of course, passes away on the 4th of July in 1826, so he gets to see much of this come to fruition. And some of those men encountered new paths through the Rockies. Lewis and Clark had discovered the northern pass through the Rockies. We don't talk about that in Western exploration and migration because it was too far north for the Mormons to go on. But we do talk about South Pass, which was rediscovered by Jedediah Smith, and the news was brought back by Thomas Fitzpatrick, and he brought that news down the Platte River to Fort Atkinson. And there the news disseminates and becomes part of this endeavor. Now, not everything was beer and skittles on the Upper Missouri. There was a lot of antipathy. The Arikara in particular were upset that one of their leaders, who Lewis and Clark had encouraged to go to Washington, had also perished in that attempt from disease. And so in 1823, they tried to prevent the fur traders from moving upstream. It's called the Arikara War. They come downstream to Fort Atkinson, gather about 1,200 troops, and go up to the Arikara villages near the Grand River and have an altercation with them. 1825, William Clark's nephew, Benjamin O'Fallon, travels up, is posted here at Fort Atkinson, and is involved in the 1825 Peace Treaties from the middle Missouri all of the way up into North Dakota. The fur trade begins to change in the 1830s and 1840s when it moves from beaver furs to buffalo hides. And this will directly affect this region as well. And that brings us to 1846, the year of decision. As famous historian Dale Morgan has noted, the Latter-day Saints encamp on Mosquito Creek. Remember those fur camps on that Diplomat map I showed you? Same location, same spot the Iowa had lived. Captain Allen recruits the Mormon Battalion here at Council Bluffs. They march 180 miles on the east side of the Missouri River down to modern-day Fort Leavenworth, where they're crossed over and then go down the Santa Fe Trail. And there are many LDS winter on both sides of the Missouri River, all along this area known as Council Bluffs. Moreover, Iowa becomes a state in 1846. I think I stayed within my time and wanted to thank you for your participation. If you have time, you can go to the Mormon Trail Center, the City of Council Bluffs, and the Council Bluffs Stake. We appreciate their efforts.